Welcome to a quiet journey into the heart of the 12th century. Close your eyes and imagine a land stretching from the shores of the Mediterranean to the rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates, a land where the call to prayer rises from the minarets, while church bells echo through stone walls. Here, two great faiths stand facing one another, not only over land, but over meaning, power, and survival. And in the midst of this storm, from the small city of Tikrit, a child is born. A child whose destiny would slowly become entwined with one of history's most decisive chapters. He grows among war tents, learns the language of politics, and is tested in the heart of battle. His choices reshape the lands of Syria and Jerusalem, and each step he takes leaves a mark upon history. Years later, his name is spoken in the palaces of Europe and the courts of the Levant, repeated in poems and written in chronicles, not as a conqueror hungry for power, but as a ruler who sought a middle path between faith and politics. This is the story of Salah ad-Din, a story of power, politics, faith, and humanity, set within one of the most turbulent eras the world has ever known. Before our story truly begins, and before we travel deeper into distant centuries, if you wish to walk with us through more quiet nights of history, subscribe and leave a like. And in the comments, tell us where you are and at what moment this journey begins for you. Your presence, like a small light in the dark, guides these nighttime stories forward. The winds of the 12th century found the Islamic world divided and unsettled. The Abbasid Caliphate, once the enduring pillar of Muslim authority, had lost its former strength, remaining little more than a name upon the tongue. From east to west, small emirs and local rulers struggled over territory and power, and the unity that had once sustained the Islamic world was slowly lost amid rivalry and betrayal. In the west, the Crusaders, armored knights from the lands of the Franks, had crossed the sea at the command of the Pope, seeking to seize the Holy Land from Muslim hands. Jerusalem had fallen. Latin kingdoms had risen in the Levant. The banner of the cross now flew over the walls of Antioch and Tripoli, and Western armies stood encamped deep within the east. Spring winds swept across the plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates, and in the city of Tikrit, in the year 1137, a child was born, a child whose fate would become bound to politics, the sword, and faith. He was named Yusuf ibn Ayyub, a simple name, unadorned and quiet, given to an infant no one yet knew would one day be spoken in palaces and monasteries alike. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, was a Kurdish emir and a loyal commander in the service of Imad ad-Din Zengi, the ruler of Mosul, and a leading figure in the struggle against the Crusaders. The Ayyubid family did not live among marble halls, but beneath the canvas of war tents and within the shifting currents of politics. Yusuf's childhood unfolded amid the thunder of hooves, the murmur of prayers, and the voices of men who drew their plans of war not on parchment, but upon the earth and in blood. Because of political and military change, his family left Tikrit and settled first in Mosul, then later in Baalbek and Damascus. These journeys, which for many would have signaled instability, became for the young Yusuf a lasting lesson. The world is shaped by change, and survival belongs to those who move with it. Unlike many commanders of his age, Yusuf took up the pen before the sword. As a youth, he studied religious sciences, law, poetry, and literature, shaping a mind as capable as his arm would later be in battle. This calm and inward-looking temperament became one of his defining traits, one even his enemies would later acknowledge. Years later, when he traveled with his uncle Asad ad-Din Shirkuh to the court of Egypt to play a role in its turbulent politics, it was this same clarity of mind and restraint in decision making that set him apart. He was not yet widely known, but within him a quiet fire had begun to burn, a fire that would one day reshape the fate of the eastern Islamic lands. And so, the child born in Tikrit, raised amid war and wandering, began to walk a path, slowly, almost unnoticed, that would carry him from the edges of obscurity into the very heart of history. Time passed quietly, almost without notice, and the boy who had once walked in the shadow of war tents had now become a young man, aware, tested, his gaze reaching beyond borders and armies. Yusuf ibn Ayyub, already known in his youth for intelligence and restraint, was no longer merely the son of a military family. In Damascus, in the service of the powerful ruler of Syria, he stepped onto a path that would shape his future. Nur ad-Din, who carried the dream of uniting the Muslim lands, saw a great danger in the West. Egypt, a wealthy and influential land ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate. Yet within that caliphate, the fire of division burned fiercely, and the ambition of the Crusaders to seize control of the Nile grew clearer with each passing day. Nur ad-Din understood that if Egypt were to fall, Syria would stand surrounded, and if Syria were threatened, the fate of the entire Islamic world would rest upon the edge of defeat. So he chose to act first. In the year 1164, a small army set out for Egypt, led by Shirkuh, Yusuf's uncle. Yusuf went with him, a man in his early 20s, whose future still lay in the shadow of greater names. Egypt in those years was consumed by unrest. The Fatimid caliphs were weakened by intrigue. Viziers were killed one after another, and the Crusaders, approaching by sea, fixed their eyes upon Alexandria and Cairo. Shirkuh carved his path by the sword, and Yusuf, at his side, calm, cautious, and observant, learned the art of rule and the games of power in the field itself. Several times they marched between Syria and Egypt. Wars followed one another without pause, and betrayal and sudden change were never far away, until, in 1169, Shirkuh emerged victorious and was appointed Vizier of Egypt. But his triumph was brief. Not long after, he died, and then all eyes turned toward Yusuf. Nur ad-Din chose him to become Vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate, a position far greater than many had expected, now known increasingly as a name meaning righteousness of the faith. He took control of Egypt's affairs. At first, he remained obedient to Nur ad-Din, proving his loyalty again and again. But Egypt was a different land, wealthy, complex, woven with hidden networks of power. Saladin moved with care. He reorganized the administration, revised the system of taxation, reshaped the army, and pushed Crusader influence away from the shores of the Nile. With time, the power of the Fatimids weakened, and in the sermons of Cairo, the name of the Abbasid Caliph replaced their own. In the year 1171, the last Fatimid Caliph died, and with him ended more than 2 centuries of Fatimid rule. In Cairo, the name of the Abbasid Caliph was spoken from the pulpits, a sign that a new order had begun. Saladin, now not only vizier, but in practice the ruler of Egypt, was laying the foundations of a power that would echo not only along the Nile and in Cairo, but throughout Syria. Yet in Damascus, Nur ad-Din was still alive, and he remained the supreme ruler. Saladin obeyed his commands with humility, presenting himself as a servant, but fate had chosen another path. In the year 1174, news of Nur ad-Din's death reached Cairo. The man who had brought Saladin into the arena of power now lay in the earth, and before the young ruler, a world of new decisions and heavy responsibilities opened wide. Saladin was no longer merely an obedient commander. Now he would have to write his own role, not in the shadow of others, but before the watchful eyes of history. With the light of Nur al-Din extinguished, the political horizon of Syria faded into uncertainty. His young son, al-Malik al-Salih, inherited his name, but not his authority. Power, which for years had rested in the hands of one man, was suddenly divided among the emirs of Syria, and rivalry rose once more. In Cairo, upon hearing this news, Salah al-Din understood that a new era had begun. There was no longer a single ruler issuing commands from Syria and shaping the course of Egypt's politics. Now he had to decide what place he would claim in this new order, a cautious observer or an active player upon a far greater stage of power. Salah al-Din did not rush. He first strengthened Egypt. He brought order to the administration, reinforced the army, and expanded his influence among judges and commanders alike. He knew that if he moved hastily toward Syria, his greatest rivals would not be found in the Crusader camps, but among the Muslim emirs themselves. And so, before any military advance, he secured the foundations of his authority. Some time later, as the disorder in Syria deepened, Salah al-Din chose to march toward Damascus. His entry into the city came not through destruction or bloodshed, but through invitation and welcome. The people of Damascus, who had lived for years under Nur al-Din's rule, saw in Salah al-Din a continuation of that same order and stability, and they opened their gates to him. After Damascus, Homs and Hama followed. Some emirs withdrew through negotiation, others resisted, and after defeat were compelled to submit. But the hardest knot lay in the north, in Aleppo. There, the Zengid family still held power and viewed Salah al-Din as a dangerous rival. Years of tension and siege followed. During this time, Salah al-Din showed repeatedly that he did not rely on the sword alone. At times he chose patience and negotiation. At others, treaties and political marriages turned hostility into agreement. His marriage to Nur al-Din's widow was not merely a family bond, but a political act that strengthened his legitimacy and eased the path toward reconciliation with the Zengids. By the middle of the 1180s, the map of power in the region no longer resembled the past. Egypt and Syria, once divided and separate, were now governed under a single authority. Through financial reform, the organization of the army, and the creation of a unified administration, Salah al-Din built a political structure capable of standing against far greater threats. In these years, diplomacy became one of his most important tools. He maintained close ties with the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad, securing the legitimacy of his rule. He formed alliances with local emirs to prevent needless bloodshed. At times he even signed temporary truces with Crusader kings, buying time to gather strength for what lay ahead, and that future, without doubt, would be decided along the coasts of Syria. The Crusader kings, ruling in Jerusalem, had not relinquished their power and still sought to expand their influence in the east. But this time, the conditions were no longer the same. From the Nile to the Euphrates, Muslim lands stood united under a single command, and before their eyes, a shared purpose began to take shape: the recovery of Jerusalem. By the middle of the 1180s, Salah al-Din was preparing himself for this decisive stage. Unity had been achieved. The structure of power was in place. and a renewed army stood waiting for command. And in the quiet nights of Damascus and Cairo, a name that had once belonged only to a young vizier in Egypt was now spoken as the ruler of a vast realm. Yet the greater test still lay ahead, not in the management of councils and courts, but in the struggle for a city that had long stood at the heart of faith itself, Jerusalem. On the slopes of stone hills, this city has stood for centuries as a meeting point between earth and sky, a place where the prayers of three great faiths intertwine, and where every stone carries the memory of prophets and conquerors. The importance of this city goes far beyond soil and stone. For the Jews, Jerusalem is the land of promise and the site of Solomon's temple, a heart for which the children of Israel struggled and wept for centuries. For Christians, this is the holiest place on earth, the city where Christ was crucified and rose from the dead. And for Muslims, Jerusalem is the first direction of prayer and the home of Al-Aqsa Mosque, the point from which the Prophet of Islam began his night journey. Nowhere else in the world are three great faiths so deeply bound together. And for this reason, Jerusalem is not merely a city on a map, but a symbol of human history itself. Yet this sanctity has never existed without turmoil. Across the centuries, Jerusalem has passed through the hands of many kingdoms and empires. The Babylonians destroyed it, the Persians rebuilt it, the Romans attacked it, and the Byzantines ruled it for generations. In the 7th century, the armies of Islam, led by Umar ibn al-Khattab, entered the city without bloodshed, bringing it into Muslim rule. For 4 centuries, Jerusalem lived under Islamic governance, a place where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side, though not always as equals. But in the year 1099, everything changed. Crusader armies, who had traveled from Europe to the east, finally reached the walls of Jerusalem. After a brutal siege, the city fell. Thousands of Muslims and Jews were massacred. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem was established, a kingdom that would rule the city for nearly 88 years, turning it into the center of Crusader power in the east. By the final decades of the 12th century, the face of Jerusalem was no longer the same. The banner of the cross shone above its walls. At the heart of the city, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the palaces of Latin nobles stood tall. Muslims were permitted to visit, but the land that had once been bound to the Islamic Caliphate had become a symbol of historic defeat, a deep wound in the heart of the Muslim world. The city remained in the hands of the Latin Kingdom and its allies. From Jerusalem, Crusader forces watched the trade routes and military paths of the East. In Egypt and Syria, this reality was unbearable for many. Jerusalem was not only sacred, but a reminder of an age of strength and unity. Its loss symbolized the collapse of that power. Within the hearts of many Muslims, the dream of reclaiming Jerusalem never truly faded, a dream passed down from generation to generation since the defeat of the First Crusade. Now, with Egypt and Syria united under the command of Salah al-Din, that dream had moved beyond longing. It had become a plan, shaped in politics and sharpened by war. Salah al-Din understood that without Jerusalem, no victory could ever be complete. And now every road he had walked, from the war tents of childhood in Tikrit to the seat of power in Cairo, was leading him toward a city that had carried the heart of three faiths within the chest of the world for centuries. And now a wind of change began to move along the ancient walls of Jerusalem, a quiet sign of the storm that was yet to come. The union of Egypt and Syria had now become an undeniable reality. Yet Saladin understood that this new unity, if not guided toward a greater purpose, would slowly sink away like still water. And that purpose had been clear in his mind from the very beginning: Jerusalem, a city that had remained in Crusader hands for nearly 88 years, not only a wound in the memory of the Muslim world, but the central stronghold of European power in the East. In the first years after the Union, Saladin did not rush into war. He knew that confronting Crusader strength required far more than the sword alone. Time had to be gained. The army had to grow stronger. The foundations of power had to be secured. During these years, he carefully built a coordinated network of garrisons and fortifications along the borders, organized supply routes, and led regular maneuvers with his commanders. The system of taxation was reformed so the war treasury would not run dry, and a more disciplined professional army emerged, no longer made up only of tribal warriors. Across from him stood the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, a crusader state that after decades of rule appeared firm on the surface, yet was deeply divided within. Its king, Baldwin IV, was weakened by illness and suffering from leprosy, and the question of succession hung uncertainly over the realm. Among the Crusader nobles and commanders, rivalries simmered and hidden tensions grew. Guy of Lusignan, the king's son-in-law, ambitious yet inexperienced, stood at odds with the older nobility. And among all these figures, one name troubled Saladin more than any other: Reynald of Chatillon, a reckless adventurer who had repeatedly attacked Muslim caravans and even dreamed of striking at the Hijaz itself. Still, Saladin was not yet seeking a final and decisive war. Instead, he sought to weaken the Crusaders from within. Several peace agreements were made between the two sides, but these truces were fragile and short-lived. Time and again, Reynald broke them. He attacked Muslim caravans, captured their people, and refused to release them, openly defying the agreements. With each violation, anger quietly spread through the courts of Cairo and Damascus. The first true signs of war emerged from Reynald's betrayals. He struck a caravan bound for the Hijaz, took its members captive, and ignored every demand for their release. This time, Saladin chose silence no longer. He sent word that such actions would not remain unanswered, and that the sword of justice would soon fall. In the year 1186, after the death of Baldwin IV and a series of succession crises, Guy of Lusignan rose to the throne. He lacked military experience, and many of his decisions were met with resistance from his own commanders. Saladin understood that the time for patience was drawing to an end. His enemy was no longer united and formidable, but divided and uncertain. In the spring of 1187, he gathered a vast army from Egypt, from Syria, from the Jazira, and from Mosul. Emirs and soldiers from across the United Lands assembled, forming great encampments in northern Syria. From the pulpits, the prayers of preachers rose for the liberation of Jerusalem. Green and black banners shifted and rippled in the wind. Everything was now in place for confrontation. The army for which Saladin had bought time, trained with care, and tested for years, stood ready for a battle that would determine not only the fate of Jerusalem, but the course of history itself. And across the plains, the Crusaders prepared their own ranks, unaware that on the dry, scorching hills of Hattin, a new chapter of history was already waiting for them. At last, in the early summer of 1187, news of Saladin's great host spread throughout the Crusader lands. Messengers arrived one after another from the borders of Syria and Jordan, bringing word that an army from Egypt and Syria was on the move. In Jerusalem and the coastal cities, church bells rang out. Crusader commanders gathered in haste, and a shared sense of fear settled over them all. A great war was coming, one that could reshape the fate of the Latin kingdom. In July of that year, the Crusader army, under the command of Guy of Lusignan, king of the Latin kingdom, set out to break the siege of a fortress at Tiberias, a decision many experienced commanders strongly opposed. They knew that leaving fortified positions and marching under the burning summer sun was a grave risk, but pride and urgency overcame caution. A single decision that would seal the fate of the war. With little water and beneath the relentless heat, the Crusader army moved forward along a route their enemy knew far better than they did. Saladin learned of their advance, and the plan he had shaped over many months was finally set into motion. He did not seek battle within cities or stone walls. Instead, he meant to draw the enemy into dry, waterless plains where the land and the sun itself would stand alongside his army. In the first days of July, the Crusader forces, exhausted and desperate for water, made camp near the hills of Hattin. Heat and thirst had weakened their ranks and worn down their spirits. Saladin seized control of the water sources and cut off all routes of retreat. Dry grass was set ablaze, and heavy smoke rose into the sky, air so thick that even breathing became difficult. At dawn, on the 4th day of July, the battle began. Saladin arranged his army in a tightening ring around the enemy, and his archers unleashed a relentless rain of arrows. Trapped, parched, and surrounded, the Crusaders lost their formation, and every attempt to break free ended in failure. Slowly, steadily, the circle closed, driving them back toward the hills. By midday, the Crusader lines collapsed. Many were slain, others surrendered, and the banners of the cross fell to the ground one after another. King Guy of Lusignan was captured and brought before Saladin's tent. Beside him knelt Reynald of Chatillon, the man who had broken treaties and plundered caravans. Saladin reminded him of his broken oaths and ordered his execution. Yet toward the king he showed mercy and spared his life. The Battle of Hattin, which lasted only a few hours, was not merely the defeat of an army. It was the collapse of Crusader power in the Levant. Their forces were nearly destroyed, and the road to Jerusalem lay more open than ever before. Saladin did not hesitate. Crusader cities and fortresses fell one by one. Acre, Nablus, Beirut, and other key centers opened their gates without major resistance. By the autumn of that same year, Saladin's army stood before the walls of Jerusalem, a city that had been in Crusader hands for nearly 90 years, now waiting for a new fate. The siege began in September of 1187. Despite strong walls, the defenders were shaken by the defeat at Hattin. Alongside the sword, Saladin turned to negotiation. He promised that if the city surrendered, the lives of its people would be spared and they would be allowed to live in safety. After weeks of resistance, the Crusaders accepted the terms. On the 2nd of October 1187, after nearly 90 years, Jerusalem returned to Muslim control. Saladin ordered the cross removed from the dome of the rock. And after almost a century, the call to prayer once again rose from the minarets of Al-Aqsa Mosque. He granted safety to women and children and paid ransom from his own treasury to free many captives. In a city that had once witnessed slaughter and vengeance, this victory was marked instead by mercy and order. This triumph did more than reshape the balance of power in the East. It redefined the meaning of victory and defeat themselves. News of Jerusalem's fall plunged Europe into shock, sending a powerful echo throughout the Christian world. And within the ancient walls of Jerusalem, after centuries of struggle, a new chapter began, a chapter that would bind the fate of East and West for generations to come. The fall of Jerusalem in the year 1187 sent a shockwave that echoed thousands of miles away, deep into the heart of Europe. In the churches of Rome and Paris, bells rang with a mournful tone, From the pulpits, preachers cried out that the holy city had been lost, and the Pope called for a new crusade, the Third Crusade. This time it was not local adventurers who took up the cross. Kings themselves entered the field. Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Philip Augustus of France, and Richard I of England, the king history would remember as Richard the Lionheart. Among them, Richard's name shone the brightest. A young king, bold and fearless, whose reputation for courage travelled ahead of his army. He had come not only to reclaim the holy city, but to face the greatest rival of his age, to measure himself against Saladin, and to carve both their names into the memory of history. In the summer of 1189, the armies of the Third Crusade reached the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. Their first objective was clear: the city of Acre, the northern gateway of the Levant. Saladin, fully aware of the city's importance, gathered his forces to hold it. The siege dragged on for months. Disease and hunger spread through both camps, and the ground was soaked with the blood of men. At last, in the summer of 1191, Acre fell, a costly victory for the Crusaders, and a warning to Saladin that the war had only just begun. Not long after, Richard and his army marched south. Near Arsuf, they met Saladin's forces. That day, a warm wind blew in from the sea. The two armies formed their lines on opposite sides of a narrow plain. Saladin launched repeated attacks with his light cavalry, seeking to break the enemy's formation, but the heavily armored European knights stood firm, a wall of iron. In the end, a sudden counterattack gave the Crusaders the field. The Battle of Arsuf was a tactical defeat for Saladin, yet strategically it changed little. The Crusaders were still far from Jerusalem and lacked the strength to advance further. As the war continued, the struggle slowly took on a more human face. Saladin, who consistently upheld the code of chivalry, sent physicians and medicine to treat Richard during his illness. And Richard, despite the enmity between them, spoke often of Saladin's courage and judgment. It is said that during one battle, the King of England's horse was killed, and Saladin, without hesitation, sent him another so the fight could continue fairly. In the midst of blood and steel, such gestures etched a different image into history's memory. Enemies who, in facing one another, also showed respect. The winter of 1191 passed, and the year 1192 arrived. The war had reached a stalemate. The Crusaders could not seize Jerusalem, and Saladin would not risk his achievements in a costly final assault. So talks began, not from weakness, but from realism. After months of negotiation, in September of 1192, the two commanders reached the Treaty of Ramla. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control. Christian pilgrims, however, would be allowed free access to the holy sites, and several coastal cities would remain in Crusader hands. For many, this marked the end of the war, but for history, it meant something more. Two great enemies had reshaped the balance of the East. Not on the battlefield, but at the negotiating table. Neither destroyed the other, yet both secured a place in history. And so, after years of blood and sword, the plains grew quiet. Saladin returned to Damascus. Richard set his course back toward the west. But their names, from that time on, were remembered not only against one another, but alongside one another. For history does not forget those enemies who fought with honor. The war had come to an end. The plains, which for years had trembled beneath the hooves of horses, fell into a new and unfamiliar silence. Banners were lowered from the fortresses. Swords were returned to their scabbards, and a cool breeze moving across the walls of Jerusalem carried the first true sign that the storm had passed. After years of struggle, Saladin returned to Damascus, a city where he had once been an unknown young man, now welcomed him not only as the conqueror of Jerusalem or the ruler of Egypt, but as a great leader, a name already etched into memory. Yet amid the joy of victory, signs of weariness appeared upon him. Years of war, sleepless nights, and endless responsibility had bent his frame and slowed his steps. When the fighting ended, Saladin faced a truth few outside the court could see. The treasury was empty. Years of campaigns and the cost of maintaining armies had drained the wealth of Egypt and Syria. He ordered that his personal possessions be given away for rebuilding and for the aid of the people. For his family, he left behind only a small amount of gold. Saladin, a man with whom kings had made treaties and whom empires had feared, spent his final days not among armies, but in quiet prayer and reflection. He no longer spoke of conquest, he no longer spoke of Jerusalem. Instead, he spoke of time and of the fragile nature of power. In the silent nights of Damascus, he would sometimes sit for hours, gazing toward the distant hills, the very hills where his armies had once stood in formation. In the winter of 1193, illness came for him. Fever and weakness slowly took their toll. The lands were at peace, the realms were united, but his body could no longer bear the weight of the years behind him. On the 4th day of March, Saladin, a man whose name had once been spoken with both fear and respect in East and West alike, passed from this world. When his possessions were counted, only a few dinars remained. He left behind no golden palaces, no hoarded treasures, only something far more enduring. The memory of a man who treated power as a responsibility, not a prize. And so his life ended as it had begun, in simplicity, and his name, just as he had wished, endured, not through the glitter of wealth, but through the weight of his deeds and the memory of mercy, carried quietly into the heart of history. With his passing, the end did not arrive. Only a gentler silence took the place of noise, as night follows a storm, quietly, without force. Time, moving more softly than any army and stronger than any sword, continued on its path. Centuries came and centuries passed. Walls that had once heard his commands fell into silence, and the earth hid countless footsteps within itself. And amid all this coming and going, something remained, something neither the passing of years could wear away, nor the forgetting of generations could erase, the memory of a man who, in the heart of turmoil, chose a different path. And we, within this calm night, within this ancient whisper, may sense something of the truth, that all the clamor, all the wars, and all the crowns eventually fade before time itself, and what remains is not the glory of battlefields, but the softness of remembrance. So close your eyes. Let history continue in silence. Let names rest in the sleep of centuries. And know this, even amid the noise of the world, a path can be found that leads to peace, just as Saladin found it at the end of his road.